We are on the stage of the future, you are on the stage of the future, all of us are on the stage of the future, and it's not just a metaphor. Always visions of fantasists were much ahead of scientists and technologists, but probably it has never been so fast. Between the first fairy tales about carpets, flying carpets, and the first airplane about the previous century, between fantastic movies and distant video connection and our smartphones, we have thousands of years. We are in our own future. And in a way, it is a challenge for, it is a threatening for culture because culture is weak and slow. German philosophist of the beginning of the 20th century, Nikolai Gartman, was right when he wrote that the highest values and categories of essence are the weakest. To be relevant to those categories and values, one has to have skills and courage to be weak and slow. But only this can make a person a person. We are not as much Homo sapiens as Homo cultus, people of culture. First of all, the definition of culture is when you harvest, when you cultivate the land, and then later it moves to higher practices, creation of books, pictures, construction of houses, temples, etc. But all of this is happening very slowly. If too fast is very dangerous for culture. It can deteriorate person, it can deteriorate temples and destroy temples in person, first metaphorically and then physically. One of the most terrible events in the history of humanity in the end of the 20th century is Handlösung, final decision. Any kind of crimes happen very fast. Time basically shrinks, but then later, for some period of time, it still can radiate with immorality and crime. It's both about Nazism and communism. And today we feel this. We understand that we cannot live that through. It is the shadow of abuse, of violence. It's on our people fates and on fates of our children. And we would like to get rid of this as fast as possible, to get rid of this shadow. But once again, culture is happening slowly, and its practices are happening in the not so fast way. And any attempt to make it faster can be threatening for culture and for us, because we are not as much Homo sapiens as Homo cultus, people of culture, cultural people. Nevertheless, there is one more threat. In a way, we can say that we basically are only biological species who do not have natural inhibitors that prevent us from destroying each other. And in a way, our culture, our second nature, it is this inhibitor. Culture saves lives. But not only culture. Sometimes culture can be threatening to lives. And here I would like to mention the thesis of other scientist and intellectual of the 20th century, Edward Said, who has this threatening phrase: the culture is a field of struggle. Struggle for geography. If Edward Said means that in big narratives, in big world global literatures, legitimation of imperial battles take place. So this struggle for geography turns into struggle for history narrative, because our history is not as much as a consequences of facts, but intertwining of different stories, and in those stories, in those narratives, the struggle is going on. Struggle for history, but at the same time it's also struggle for our present and struggle for our future. So I'm going to repeat myself. Culture is not always only an inhibitor for destroying life. Culture is not only constructive and positive. Culture is a field of struggle of different narratives, and it only seems to us that it is happening virtually. In the reality, sometimes it has specific, sometimes terrible consequences. One more negative moment that can be connected with culture is the fact that it only seems to us that culture is always emancipating, that it is always that it always frees us. It's pretty great ideas, and they are quite beautiful, but reality is different. History shows that culture can sometimes be connected with violence. It can mask violence, not only prevent violence, but mask it. Seductive eye of culture, as the eye of the spider, can lure, can calm down, and can be threatening at the same way. Big imperial cultures create such very beautiful, very attractive illusion that you want to believe in, but very often after that illusion we have terrible abuse. Lots of people in the middle of the 20th century couldn't believe that the nation from which we had Goethe and Beethoven can have such terrible crimes. Lots of us now do not want to believe in the fact that the nation that gave rise to Shostakovich and Pushkin can create such terrible crimes. But unfortunately, it is a historic fact, and we have to live with it. And on how we perceive it now, our future will depend. So again, I'm going to repeat myself. Culture is not only the field of struggle, it's also sometimes pretty threatening practice, and it can be not only emancipating, it can also put you in behind the bars. So it all happens with the situation. It is now all coincides with the situation that we are right now. I mean pandemic, and I cannot but mention it today, because even looking at you, at your faces, I see mostly masks, and it protects us. It's correct, but it also creates distance. Distance is basically one of the most important words that we hear nowadays. We move to distance, you shift to distance. We close theaters, universities move to distance learning, galleries virtualize. We today, with the help of one click, can communicate with the person who lives on a different side of the planet, but we cannot meet our relatives, our close ones. We hesitate, we put them off, we slow down. And on the basis of all of this, the words that culture is slow and weak sound a little bit differently. They will have a little bit different background, a little bit different sense. But it's our present, and so nowadays, and our future also depends on it. So I'm going to repeat myself again. Culture is weak and slow. We have to cherish it, but at the same time we should always remember about the threats that are connected with different cultural practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Vakhtang KEBULADZE. I hope I spell your name right. Yeah. It's an honor to be introduced by you. I know also he's the translator of one of my favorite philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche. So it's really an honor to have you here. And I remember this whole idea of slowness and culture. I have to go and stand there, okay, otherwise I'm not seeing. Hello. Thank you for inviting me, Jarina, and the Cultural Strategy Institute, I understood as it was. I'm very happy to be here in Ukraine again. I also already want before to thank the translators. I know they have a hell of a job to do this, and it was wonderful translated, I understand also. It's the first time that I see somebody translating like that. In Belgium, it doesn't happen where I am. So we are not such an inclusive society as you are here at the moment. I want to talk today about the ongoing research, what I'm doing. And it is very much related to my own, even my own personal or emotional experiences the last 2 years, we need to say, with COVID-19. And that's exactly to do what my research is really about, what was the impact of COVID-19 on the cultural field, on cultural institutions, but exactly also what did it do with society and what can we learn from it on the long run. And I prepared a PowerPoint. I don't know if you see it. I hope so on the screen, but I will use this. And the title is Urban, there it is. Urban intimacy, because I think this is what we missed the last 2 years, but I will of course explain this more, what this is about. But I think urban intimacy, it's already in the subtitle, is something which can constitute semi-public spaces. And semi-public spaces is a space like here we really need, but I will go in detail to that. First, let's start here with the catastrophe. The catastrophe like COVID-19, I think it was a catastrophe which touches us enormously, and we still see the consequences today, not only when we wear masks, but also it has enormous influence on my students, for example, on colleagues. You see now, after this pandemic, there is rising up another pandemic, and it's the pandemic of social isolation, burnout, and we see indeed that culture has also its weaknesses, and it has its weaknesses exactly because it's built up here. And what we exactly missed, I think, while the pandemic was a typical kind of relationships, a typical kind of living together, a typical kind of cohabitation. And this was this kind of social relations we have here also now today, I think, is the typical way of being together in a theater, in a concert hall, on a festive hall, so where you share something like culture, but at the same time share something with other people. And it is exactly this kind of relationship what we had what was in fact during the pandemic criminalized. You could only stay or in your own private bubble with intimate people, or you had only professional meetings, mostly digital, on the internet with people, and there was nothing anymore in between. And it's exactly this in between what I'm trying to explain today. So also, that's the other picture showing all the cafes, pubs were closed. So also there you have this typical kind of social relationships, what I call togetherness, in a kind of semi-public space, which disappeared immediately. And that was the reason, or the origin of thinking about this. What does this mean? What is exactly the intention, the meaning of this kind of relationships. What are we missing there, and what are those kind of relationships also doing for society on the long run? So what came in, I mentioned already, was digitalization. Or we lived only in our bubble of intimate people, or we saw each other on screens. And it's in the small book, which is also translated in Ukrainian, Nearness. I explain I tell this anecdote of a friend of mine who was Marlies de Munk, who is co-author of the book, sent me a film of her father who was a piano player, who played, by the way, a lot in Ukraine. And he showed, he played piano, but for his own cell phone. And which was very clumsy to see him playing there. He's a very fantastic player, but he felt so uncomfortable. And exactly after when he played, he went to the camera, to his own phone, and you see at his face there was something wrong. There was really something missing. And I was wondering, what is he missing? Is it his grandchildren? Is it his family? Is it the people as a concert player? And it was exactly that. He felt quite helpless. And that did me realize that digitalization never can replace cultural life experiences. It is a completely other experience what you have with digitalization than when it is live. And one was said before me that also culture is slowly, I think it's not only slow, it is definitely slow to integrate culture, etc. But it has also to do with physical nearness. You need to be physical near to other people also, not only the artists, but also there need to be a physical nearness with other people when you share an artistic experience to translate and transform culture on the long run. So it's a slow process, but it's definitely also a collective process, and it is it's a really physical process. It is also, what's my Dadaist, it's visceral. It is really not only about words, it's not only about symbols and codes, it is really also about touch, smell, atmosphere, the breathing together, tension, something which you almost cannot grasp. And I think the cultural transformation is really also there. It is on this kind of level which no scientist can touch or can measure. And it's that exactly what you can have, I think, in those spaces. So those spaces stand for me for, at the same time, distance and nearness. What I mean by this is that when you sitting together like today, you feel nearness, you sit next to each other, so it's physical nearness. But at the same time, and it's an old idea of Walter Benjamin, of the aura, at the same time he explains this about in the work, The Technical Reproduction of Art. He explains this for artworks, but my colleague Marlies de Munk explains this also for human. When you are near to somebody, you feel nearness, but at the same time, you always have the feeling that there is something beyond, that there is a history, that there is a context, that there is an autobiography. You cannot touch it, you cannot rationalize it, but it is there. And that is something which completely lacks digitalization. In the digital atmosphere, you don't have this. And this exactly has to do with the concept of aura, but exactly this feeling of feeling near. And you can only also, this is also important, you can only get close to somebody, get touched by somebody, because you feel there is something behind you never can touch, and you never can realize. And it is this kind of almost dialectics between those two, which is for me, constitutive, when I talk about the constitutive of the cinema with the public space, it's constitutive for cultural transition. It is constitutive also for an artistic experience. This kind of in-between nearness and distance. And this is something we lost. And even before COVID, I think we lost. And we know already, know a lot of politicians, but also sometimes theater directors, event programmers in cultural field, try to make this connection again, try to revitalize art again. And they found out a lot of tricks. Also artists do. For example, they make social work. They go into the social field and they try to do kind of emancipatory work with, in suburbs or in other cultures, etc. Which is fantastic, I think, when artists do this, social artistic work, community artwork, etc. And they try to, in this way, revitalizing art. But I think they miss a point in it, but I come to this later. Another thing we all know is that, especially politicians are interested in this, they try to revitalize by redefining, for example, culture as creative industry, tourism, events, so for economical reasons. That's a second way of trying to revitalize art. A third one is how artists often try to do it, playing virtuosity, and virtuosity that they really try to play as the best. In a very technical, sophisticated way, they try to convince the public. But often what you have then is a kind of sterile, neutral, I call it even Frankenstein art, something, a kind of revitalization which is not really vital, it's not really alive, because it only plays the technical side of it. Another way to revitalize was human interest. Typical in mainstream media, you have these interviews nowadays with artists about their traumatic life, their social life, their relationships, etc. And so they try to revitalize art by the private experience of an artist. But when an artist is maybe interesting because of his private life, it does not yet mean that he makes interesting art. So there's definitely not a causal relationship between those two. So these were all tricks. We were already confronted before COVID to revitalize this art, but I think they miss something very important. And that's what I call the Trill of Life. And this is exactly, I think, what I was explaining before, is this feeling of liveliness, of life in somebody, which gives you a thrill. And I'm working now also with my colleague Marlies de Munk, the philosopher, on this. It has to do, in our eyes, with an experience that you see in somebody at stage, or can be also in an object, in an art piece. You see not only the liveliness of somebody, that there is life in it, but you see also almost literally the vulnerability in it, and because of the liveliness, you see also that in it. It's the same. It are the same sides, or the different sides, sorry, of the same coin. And it's exactly this double feeling, like culture as also as a disaster, as a deconstruction, as a catastrophe, and at the same time as the feeling of liveness, being alive, vital. And this double feeling really gives you the thrill of life. And again, it's very difficult to explain this, to rationalize this, or to measure this. It is something you feel or you don't feel when you experience an art piece. And why do you feel it? I think when you have this experience, what I call an aesthetic experience, you feel yourself in a kind, what I call an arc of tension. And that I mean by that, you feel almost literally when you have, when you see, you are convinced or you are embedded in a work of art, you really find it beautiful, you are amazed by it or astonished by it. At that moment, this feeling, what this exactly is, I think, is that at the same time you feel in heaven, you feel very big, very great, but at the same time very small and really down to earth. So it's this kind of double feeling when you feel also really embedded in a culture, in a tradition, which closes you in, which almost feels sometimes like an iron cage in the tradition where you're in. And at the same time, because you have this very unique, singular experience, you feel free of it. And it's this double movement, also between the collective and the individual subjective, which is this tension of the arc of tension. And this is for me really the essence, I think, of an aesthetic experience. That's why you love art. And also, like love, you cannot, there are thousands and thousands words written about love, but nobody touches it what it really is. You cannot bring it into symbols and words. It stays always untouchable, and you cannot explain why you, for example, fall in love on a person. Of course you can rationalize that because she or he has this and this and this characteristics, but really where it is, you cannot touch it. And I think this is the same feeling when an art piece touches you. It is this what you cannot explain. It's also the reason why you easily can explain why you think an art piece is bad. You can criticize it easily, but to explain why it is good, it's very difficult. And that's also what is very interesting for me is then when you, for example, come with your friend, a close friend, out of the cinema or out of the theater, and your friend, your partner, likes the film and you don't like the film. And then you have this kind of very embarrassing discussions. You try to convince the other why the film or the theater was good, but you never can get there. And you get really emotional or some emotional confrontations because you don't understand the other, why he or she doesn't share the same feeling. It's exactly that. I think it's exactly this visceral moment where what you cannot touch, which is the aesthetic experience, and which makes the transition of culture and even makes the dynamics in the culture possible. And to make this transition possible, you need a kind of intimacy. And this is called what Alan Bloom, it's a sociologist, called urban intimacy. What is this about, this urban intimacy, which is again constructed in semi-public spaces like this one? It is something between anonymity and the intimate. So that means that, of course, you can be people in this space you know, but others you don't know. And it is something in between. So it are also maybe people you even don't want to know, you don't like, but you share the same experience. And this is exactly this in between the intimate and the anonymity in it. So it's between strangers and close friends. It is between something you already know. You feel, I think most of you, comfortable in this setting because you know the setting already. Yeah? It gives you this feeling, I know this. You're feeling in a way a little bit like a home, but at the same time, especially in this setting, you're also confronted with something new. And it's this in between also which makes this urban intimacy. So between the familiar, the unfamiliar, the public and the safe space. It's not a safe space. You're triggered maybe, you're taking a risk. But it is also not a public space in which you know what can happen, and not know what can happen, and in which your behavior is a little bit different than in this place. In this place, you feel quite comfortable, you know you can trust each other in a way, and you trust also and this trust comes because you have a shared interest. A shared interest can be in a theater, in a film, in a cultural presentation. So it is also, and this is also for me important, it's something which it's not only about just emotion, it's something you understand. It has to do with consciousness, cognitive skills even, but it's not rationality also. It is literally something in between. It's something we all understand, but at the same time, we cannot point our finger on it. And it is this in between which makes a kind of urban intimacy, and it is exactly this atmosphere we really need to build up semi-public spaces, and also to have a transition of culture. I think so. And this is very much related to a notion of, it's feminist politicist Young, who calls this the urban erotic gaze. What does she mean by that? It has nothing to do with sex or something like that. She literally says that when you go, for example, to a city trip, you are always open for the new. You're walking to the streets and you're very curious what happens around the corner. And there's this kind of excitement you have, which he calls the erotic gaze. So it's always looking for the unexpected, being open also, being curious for it. And in that sense, the erotic gaze is also quite the opposite of the xenophobic gaze. The xenophobic gaze is already beforehand in fear for the other, for otherness. And the erotic gaze is curious for the other. It's open for the other. And it's exactly this what happens, for example, in open spaces which are in between the private and the public space, like a cafe, for example. In a cafe or pub, in the evening, you are at the same time feel quite familiar. Maybe it's your favorite pub where you're in it. You have some friends there, but you know also you can always meet there other people, and there will be, and you're keen for it. You want to see them. And this is exactly this kind of relationship. You are curious for otherness in this space, but you are only curious for this because you feel quite safe. You feel that there is no danger. And this is, I think, again, the double side of the semi-public space in which makes a difference. So, what is the semi-public space about? I show you here, this is the opera in the Muntschouwburg, the opera in Brussels. And the picture or the print is made of a certain anecdotal moment in Belgian history. But first of all, what are the characteristics of a semi-public space? Maybe first step back. Why do I stress this? Most of the urban sociologists or urban studies who look at cities and the dynamics of cities, they only study two spheres: the private sphere and the public sphere. And I want to stress very much there is something which in between, which is constitutional for both the private and the public sphere, but which is also very much constitutional for the public sphere, culture in public, but also even constitutive for public politics. And that is what I call then the semi-public space. So it's open and it's closed at the same time. So in fact, this conference is open. Everybody can come, is invited, but at the same time, you know, there are some borders, symbolic borders. You need to be interested. maybe financial borders, etc. Time, to be here at this moment of the day. So it's open and closed at the same time. And there are at the same time also certain rituals to get in. Just to leave your jacket in another room. Be silent when you come in. So this kind of rituals make the constitution of a semi-public space. So again, it's not public where you can do, or at least expect, whatever you want. No, it's not. There are certain rules. And this makes exactly the atmosphere which you need of trust in such a space. So it's unsafe and safe at the same time, because you know you can trust the situation, but maybe here happens something which can touch you. It's always in between. And this, I think, is really bridging, I think, for societies also, the private and the public sphere. And it's really necessary. And this was exactly what was even forbidden, criminalized during the pandemic. This kind of, this in-between space, which is also a space in that sense where you, for example, just when you go to a cultural event or when you go to a pub, it is always the space where relationships can stay anonymous or they can get very close and intimate. You don't know. It's open. And exactly this in between, so where the bridge can happen between private and public life, is the semi-public space. And this is also the really, I think it's really the fundament, it's a fundament of society. So not only public space, not only private space, but the semi-public space. So, and I mentioned, I'll stress this already, so it's a space of physical nearness in sharing effects, in this sense, for culture, etc. It is because you share something. You share together certain emotions, enthusiasm, but also maybe crying during a theater piece or something like that. You dare to do this because you are in the semi-public space where you can trust each other. You dare to show, in a sense, your emotions. You will never do this in public space. You would only do this in private space. And the semi-public space helps you in something in between this, showing your emotions collectively to others. And so in this, this is a typical definition of how trust is built. Trust is also built when you dare to show your emotions to somebody else. You can only have an intimate relationship with somebody else when you show your secrets, your feelings. A scar can be also a naked body. So trust is built up in this way. First, it needs to be trust, but you build up more trust also by sharing this kind of secrets in it. And this, again, is for me very much the condition to integrate art in a cultural tradition, to come with something new, etc. You need exactly this slowness, it was mentioned in it, which takes place, but also this physical nearness. But it's not only important for culture and the transition of culture on the long run and the existence of culture, it's also very important for politics and democratic politics, etc. That's also why I showed this building in Brussels, so in Belgium. It is a print of 1830, when started the Belgian independent revolution. And it started in this opera house. In this opera house there was the opera La Mouette de Portici, the Dumb of Portici. And after this, and this is for me very important, some say, yeah, there were some revolutionary talks in the opera already. Yeah? So they said something, Viva la Révolution or something like that in the space. But that didn't matter. What was important that in the space, the people get loaded together. They knew they could trust each other at that moment. So it was a very, not an intellectual or a rational experience. It was really a visceral experience where you felt the bodies next to you were in the same line. And then, after the opera, they went out and they declared a revolution and the independence of Belgium. So before they went to the public space, they were loaded politically in the semi-public space. And this is exactly what I try to touch. This is really this kind of feeling you can only have and build up in the semi-public space. And I think that's also why semi-public spaces are so constitutive for society, the political landscape, but also for our culture. So the Belgian Revolution started there. It's an anecdote in our history. It's not such an important thing, but I think exactly it shows, it demonstrates what the function is of those semi-public spaces. So that's the reason why I also think it's very important now, after COVID-19, after the catastrophe, to think about the relationship between art and politics again. And I think it is really, and politics, I don't mean party politics or something like that. I mean really politics like the philosopher Jacques Rancière calls it, is politics is for him, the political is giving form to being together. It's giving form to society. That's politics about, and can be different things. And again, I think culture and semi-public spaces are constitutive for that. They make this possible. They make also transitions in the society possible. So it's constitutive for that. And I've tried to pronounce the third concept of this conference, but I will completely fail now. I think it's theatrocracy. I tried to rehearsal it yesterday and I came always out with theocracy, but that's something else. But for me, theatrocracy is exactly has to do with this, I think. It is not politics, but it is related to what I call a kind of poetic activism. And it is something else than just an activist who goes on the street and who protested. And I try to make this clear with one example. This man standing here is, this is in Istanbul at Taksim Square 2013. This is a choreographer standing there. Gunduz is his name, his family name. And he decided, it was after the riots at Gezi Park, and you cannot, in the streets you could not anymore protest. It was forbidden and not be in collectives anymore. So he decided just to stand still. Stand still at the square, standing there. He decided there to stand for months. That was his intention. Just looking at a cultural house, it is demolished now, there's a new one standing there at Ataturk, let's say the base of democracy, the person who in a way made the modern state for Turkey. So he decided to stand there. As a choreographer, he uses, this for me very interesting, he uses in fact certain conventions of dance by standing still. It's a classical and conceptual dance. You have this. Jerome Bell did this. Standing still. I'm dancing. That's a convention. But he does this in public space. So people get very curious about this. What is he doing there? Is he an artist? Is he a crazy man? Or is he protesting? And it was very ambivalent. And what is interesting is only that the police came there to look at him, what are you doing here? But he refused to answer, he said nothing. But the police also were very aware, we cannot intervene, we cannot do anything. He had also no slogans for this. Again, but it was, some people thought he's protesting, others not, etc. He stayed in ambiguity. Only at the end, a lot of people posted it on Instagram, etc. So a lot of people collective, and then the police came in and could intervene because it became collective. But until then, even then, he refused to say something politically, make slogans, etc. He just stood there. It was definitely clear he was against what happened on Gezi Park, etc. But his own position in it stayed very ambiguous. And this is for me very much the moment of ambiguity, which is very interesting, I think, in this poetic activism, which is politically, but has also, let's say, an openness. It has also, again, to say it, something erotic. People were curious. What is this guy doing here? So they were curious. And it's not the activists saying, I'm for this and I'm against that. Then there is no openness anymore. It's an attack, and I think it's very worthful what activists do. But what he's doing is, I'm also against, but the alternative still open. I don't know. And it's the not knowing which creates this openness, but also this curious. And I think this is something really powerful, which culture and exactly art related to politics can do, making this openness again. And for me, this is also what I call the power of vulnerability, another word where I've always problems with to pronounce. This vulnerability is exactly what Gunduz is, for example, showing by standing still there, alone, silent. He takes risks, knows this. So he shows his own vulnerability. And I think this is a very worthful and very strong thing I think art can do, and which is for me very much related to this notion of poetic activism. And I end with one example. Maybe you saw this also, and I use this example. It's maybe too, how you say, too cliche, but I know almost everybody in the world saw this. So now we have a shared reference point by that. It's the poem of Amanda Gorman when she was in the inauguration of Joe Biden. You remember the girl, colorful, standing there and bring this beautiful poem, climbing up the mountain. But she showed it also in a very vulnerable way. And what she did there was, for me, it was amazing in that sense that she put it in the center of power at that moment. She showed the vulnerability of power at the same moment. She showed the human in it and its own vulnerability inside of this power system. So she really mirrored politics in a way. So in that sense, it was almost, for me, literally disarming in this sense. And that is what I call poetic activism. It is like, it's the strongest thing what you can do, I think, is putting a flower in a barrel of a gun. It's this kind of poetic gesture what you do, and I think this you can hit power, or art can hit power, not more than that. By doing this, it is showing your own vulnerability in front of power is the strongest way, I think, to convince. So I won't end here. Thank you.
welcome all the guests and partners. Welcome everyone who's watching us online. This part of the Congress obviously will not be as inspirational as the previous one. It's more ceremonial in its nature, but amid the times in which we are living, such things need to happen as well. We as the organizers would like to welcome everyone who are here today with us because you are not random people. Current times make us keep social distancing, make us get the vaccines to be present during events like this, and this is a luxury, so I'm happy that we are able to be here. We have met here today during this biennial event, and we have the opportunity to ask each other, how are you doing? What have you been doing over the past 2 years? What have you achieved? What can we do together? What can we as a community question? And what are the things that we as a community can move forward with? I'm again thanking everyone present here today. I wish all of us a fruitful work. I wish that we have a fruitful exchange of thoughts which will be embedded in our minds, because the future is the topic of our Congress, and during the upcoming 3 days we will be working within 3 thematic blocks. Today we are discussing catastrophe, tomorrow we will be discussing cohabitation, and day number 3 will be dedicated to theocracy. So we will be having public debates and discussions. And you can also see that along with the topics of the Congress, we have the artistic part, the artistic component to our event. And I wish all of you to discover those messages that we wanted to convey in this artistic part together with the curators of this event. Now I would like to approach the people who are creating cultural tendency in regions and cities, people responsible for what is happening in the sphere of culture. And it's very important and valuable for us that alongside artists and independent artistic figures, we have the opportunity to involve people who we can ask direct questions to, and we would like to, for this opportunity to be maintained in the future. So present here with us today is our Minister of Culture and Information Policy, Oleksandr TKACHENKO. The head of Lviv Regional State Administration, Maksym is not yet here with us, and we have Vice Mayor of the city of Lviv, Andriy present with us here today. We were expecting Andriy Ivanovich SADOVYI to be here with us, and today we have his deputy representing the Lviv City Council. So in addition to the welcoming speech, I would like to ask the following question. Just recently, the Prime Minister of Spain has announced that all young Spaniards of age will receive 400 euros a ticket for culture. This is a kind of response to COVID and the reality in which we are living, and it's also the sign that the state and the government are interested in young people, and they are investing in them and reminding them that being amid the culture of young people is important for the state. In Ukraine, we have very many lists of people's artists of Ukraine, many things that we spend money on. But is our state capable of not probably copying this practice, but doing something similar? I'm not speaking about financial capacities here, but about finances as well. But the question is more about the priorities of state policies. So what is the core of state culture policy of Ukraine, and how do we create a future for it? So that's the question to our Minister of Culture. Thank you for the question. I don't feel very comfortable sitting here on the balcony because that feels like part of a ceremonial procedure. You feel like a Grossmeister for some reason. In terms of existing practices, starting last year, we already had these discussions, but this year we have started practical implementation of certificates. We had conversations with communities, and it turned out that there are 3 industries that are willing to work with certificates. These are publishers, cinemas, and hotel owners. We have developed this project already. We've had several meetings with our Prime Minister and the Minister of Finances. The model is quite obvious. We have appealed for additional funding from the state budget, but currently we're in the middle of the budgeting process, and we will need to see how it happens. But thankfully, over the past year, the number of people who realize that culture is not an empty word, the number of that people has increased, and I believe that such practices can be implemented in Ukraine. So again, these are certificates for people of age who are 18 and older. Thank you very much. Another question. Again, asking you about the core elements of cultural strategy in Ukraine. What are the pillars that the cultural policy of Ukraine is built on? And what are the institutions that are implementing it? There are very many institutions like that, and if we use the language of a budgeting process or budget programs, we have the largest number of institutions out of all the ministries in Ukraine, and practically we can single out some of them. But the most important thing that I've noticed over the year and a half that I've been the minister, I realized that people are the most important institution. People are the pillars that support culture. The activity of the community is what determines how successful the strategies and policies in the sphere of culture are. Thank you very much. Thank you for answering the question. Mr. Deputy Mayor, during the previous Congress, our mayor announced the program focused on culture. It was quite an ambitious target, and this program allowed for more than 12 million hryvnias to be invested in culture, and culture figures in Lviv were able to implement many different projects and programs. But besides that, we always speak that culture needs to be a space for creating contents and senses, that beside the wow effects, we need to reinvent some things through culture. I would like to ask you about Lviv, which is considered the city of culture. What can Lviv give back to the country in terms of sense and content? What are we doing in this respect, and what should we do so that the future culture scene becomes better? Good afternoon, everyone. This is a very unusual setting for me, but I have to admit that all unusual things are very interesting. Coming back to your question, Yuliya, about reinventing senses. When we reach a specific limit and we realize that we need to reinvent senses, then we ask ourselves a question: where are we going? We are going to a place where we can reinvent and find those senses, and that is culture. If we speak about Lviv and its mission, it's all quite simple. Our mission is about people, about creating spaces. After that, we will bring up politicians and policies. I'd like to draw your attention to a very important thing. I think we discussed that just recently. How many independent and strong institutions with new senses have appeared during the independence era? Last year was an example when one gallery was established, another museum was opened, And those institutions had this space that is being born in their DNA. Maybe the people who didn't think they would be managing a museum or a cultural institution 2 or 3 years ago are now at the head. So we need to create such institutions. We need to focus on culture. I was just recently browsing through my feed and I saw that one of the projects of the focus on culture program became very successful. That's one of the projects that we were having in cooperation with the Ukrainian Catholic University. We need to realize who will be in charge of cultural institutions tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. And for those people to be successful in the future, we need to educate them today. So the mission is to create an environment in which the people willing to create senses, willing to lead, will be brought up, but this will happen in joint cooperation. What will happen after Focus on Culture program? The mayor asked about initiatives for the continuation of the program, and the opening of the question, the answer to this question is focus on the culture and setting up a culture foundation. The Institute of Cultural Strategy is actually working on that, on setting up a foundation. We are scaling up our experiencing and they are being replicated in other cities of Ukraine. I know that people in Kharkiv and Vinnytsia are working towards the creation of such a foundation. So, Andriy, how do you see a network of municipal culture funds in regions, and how can they cooperate with the principal investor in this sphere, the Ukrainian Cultural Fund? And is there an understanding how this cooperation will take place? Is there any procedure for the cooperation between the state-run foundations and regional and municipal funds? And how can you assess this process of cooperation? We need to have municipal foundations. I know that the work on setting up such a foundation is being done in Lviv and some other cities, but of course they need to cooperate with the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, and I think the state needs to invest in that as well. And the municipal governments also need to do that. So this network, which can cover the entire country and open access to culture in Kyiv, Lviv, and small towns and villages to Ukrainians, this network is very important in terms of being saturated with new content and senses. Today we are working within the catastrophe thematic block, and the catastrophe amid which we've been living for the past year and a half is COVID. So COVID and culture. What are we, the city and the country, doing so that culture is less vulnerable? There are various institutions of various forms of ownership. Some of them are more vulnerable, some are less vulnerable. So culture and COVID, what should our actions be? Andriy, the city and COVID. So last year, when we had this first strong wave in Ukraine, you know that in Lviv, we launched express testing, but basically that was express support of projects for up to 50,000 hryvnias, and it showed its efficiency. We are entering a new wave, and of course, if the situation repeats itself, we will be responding quickly. I will just give you an example of yesterday when we had the session of Lviv committee dealing with emergencies, and we were discussing quarantine limitations. I will not be giving you any names. Just one of our colleagues, not a representative of Lviv City Council, told us we need to shut everything down, businesses, culture institutions, and we told that person why. If a person is vaccinated, why can they not come? Why they cannot attend those institutions? So basically the response of the city was the following. What is the essence of culture then if we have many artists and everybody attending events is vaccinated, and there were very many cultural institutions which showed a good example? So our vision is that on the current circumstances, we will be on the side of those who are leading and those who are creating senses. I would like to add, last year via the Ukrainian Culture Fund, we spent more than 700 million in supporting artists and representatives of culture industry. We are in the middle of audit, and there are some aspects we are now checking the applications. So that is the other side of this coin. So we are running into taxation issues. So there are very many positive sides to this funding, yet there are some disadvantages. And if you ask me how we can fight COVID, my only answer is vaccination. We have discussed it with the colleagues that if we want to continue working, we need to show an example. I mean, theaters and cinemas and their staff, everybody has to be vaccinated. I had a meeting with staff members asking them about vaccination rates, and they told me 99%. And they told me, when asked why, they told me because we went on tour, that's why they had to get vaccinated. And I'm pleased to remark that in most institutions the vaccination rates is 80% and higher, and this tells us that we can continue working, and we are constantly having a dialogue with the Ministry of Health. So people working in the sphere of culture, because their role and significance in the society are quite considerable, their example can show how we can fight this disease. Another question to both of you, and after that you can say a couple of words to our participants if you'd like to. The final small question: do we have an understanding of the budget 2022 for culture in Ukraine and in Lviv? And if you have the numbers, could you tell us about the budget of the Ukrainian Culture Fund, because that is something we are all interested in, something that will determine the investment in ideas, in institutions and in people. Next week we will be having the hearing of the budget, the first reading of the budget at the Verkhovna Rada. I was just having a conversation with our MPs just to have an understanding. The budget submitted by the Ministry of Finances is somewhere in the region of 10 billion, but our request was to have another 10 billion on top of that. So the Ukrainian Culture Fund will have the budget of 700 million, but we will have additional funding for the great restoration projects. There are very many requests and objects that require restoration. Again, cinema also needs assistance. Our cultural institutions and colleges and universities also need financial help, because when I come to our musical academies and I see that the musical instruments they are using were made back in the 70s and 80s, then I see that the situation is very sad. So we need investment. Investment returns not just in the form of money, but also in the form of educated and culturally biased people. So we are reiterating the same phrase that the Minister of Culture is tired of hearing. We tell them that the Ministry of Culture shouldn't be less important than the International Monetary Fund. Our minister will be present during another section dedicated to ecosystem of culture. So I'm coming back to our deputy mayor with the same question, and maybe you'd like to address Lviv residents. I'll just add another word about vaccination. Again, running through my feed, I saw that our key stakeholders are so active in terms of vaccination that we are even having vaccination centers opened at cultural institutions so that people have the motivation to get vaccinated. I think it's a very nice example. Regarding the budget, it will be approved in December. And the opinion of our mayor is the same as mine and the same as the people who understand the importance of culture, consists in the following. We have cultural institutions among our key institutions. So we need to assist them in the ability to provide their services. We need to help theaters like this one, in which we are having our congress. It is very important. It is important to implement the programs already launched, which will be institutionalized starting from the next year. And this is your great contribution, Yuliya, and your great work within the Culture Fund. And our task is for the number of such projects and support to increase each year. Thank you, Oleksandr and Andriy, for participation. And again, I'm expressing my gratitude. And let me take another minute of your attention to mention those who contributed to the creation of this event. This event is organized by the Cultural Strategy Institute and Virmenska 35 Cultural Union. I'm thanking the curators Oksana Dostoyevska, Zoriana Rybchenska, and Ms. Forostina. I'm thanking Alexei Horoshko and Vlodko Kaufman. The Congress would not be possible without resource support of the institutions which became our partners this year. That's first of all Lviv City Council. The city supports this event. The Renaissance International Foundation, thank you very much. They are also our partners. A new foundation created in Lviv, Strategic Change Foundation, Jam Factory, and Gerald Binder Cultural Enterprises are also our partners this year. Thank you for being involved, and I believe that we can do much more together. And I'm also expressing gratitude to KredoBank. We are following our schedule. Thank you for listening to us. We are going to have a short break and we will start the next block in several minutes. Dedicated to the topic of catastrophes, I'd like to start with the following. The topic we've chosen for today was chosen not very successfully because some of the participants who were present or who were announced to be present for this discussion cannot be present due to health condition, but I believe that the discussion will not be less interesting. Before I introduce the moderator of this discussion, let me tell you a couple of words about day one. The topic of catastrophes has been present during the first speeches of the Congress. We decided to discuss this concept, this category within different contexts and dimensions. We will start the discussion of this topic by a conversation of philosophers who will speak about the topos of catastrophe in modern culture, how this category, how this topic defines our perception of life, and whether we have a chance for catastrophe to transform itself into catharsis. Then we will continue our discussion after lunch. We will have representatives of museums and also culture decision makers. We will end day one with a lecture of eco-philosopher Andriy, who thankfully will be able to join us online from the United States. So I invite you to listen attentively and to communicate with our speakers and participants of the discussion. We will have volunteers working in the audience, so if you want to ask a question to any of our speakers, please raise your hand, they will give you the mic. And now I would like to welcome and introduce the moderator of our first discussion, Mr. Andriy Dakhny. Andriy, you are welcome. Andriy is a doctor of philosophy, head of the Department of Philosophy History of the Ivan Franko National University of Lviv, who was kind enough to work with this topic several days prior to the Congress because of the critical health situation of the initial moderator, Oleksandr. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for being ready to participate in today's discussion, and I'm giving you the mic. Thank you, Zoriana, for welcoming me. So dear colleagues, we will try to have this continuity in our work today, regardless of all the serious hindrances that we've had on our way. We should have quite a fundamental discussion within our 3-day event, and the most significant thing for our Congress, I think that the inspirational speeches of Vakhtang KEBULADZE and Pascal GIELEN made us have a very productive and fruitful style of work. Today we are having 2 guests. We plan to have more guests initially, but coronavirus had to intervene, so we are having Valeria Korobleva, Doctor of Philosophy, here with us, researcher of social processes in Eastern Europe, professor of Karlova University in Prague, and we are also having our Polish colleague, professor from Wrocław, Leszek Koczanowicz, who is a psychologist, philosopher, and sociologist. So this interdisciplinary peculiarity of our discussion will be quite distinct. I welcome Valeria and Leszek. We can probably stand, or shall we sit down? In any case, so I'd like to refer to some of the statements expressed initially in the morning. This section is, of course, the discourse of catastrophe, but I'd like to go back to some of the key statements expressed by the first 2 speakers in the morning, because when we speak about inspiration, it's the key word here. As far as I understood, there are some critical differences in understanding of our topic on the part of Vakhtang and Mr. Pascal GIELEN. We can see some cross-sections, and one of such cross-sections is the fact what Pascal GIELEN called power of vulnerability, and what Vakhtang KEBULADZE called the weakness of culture. This weakness can be also the strength. So we should speak about fragility of culture, but at the same time we realize how important culture is in societal processes, socio-cultural processes, and I hope that we will be able to continue discussing these aspects. Another statement which I found to be very important, one expressed by Vakhtang KEBULADZE, was the statement about slowness and speediness, and something similar was expressed by Mr. GIELEN, who said that because of the coronavirus pandemic, we are losing the culture of physical intimacy, of physical presence in the same place, when we are losing the aura of coexistence. So I see this need to draw parallels between what we call close reading and cross-reading. When we speak about intimacy and close reading, and when we speak about quick reading, just skimming the text, which foresees the maximum speed of reading. And Mr. KEBULADZE formulated this quite clearly. We see that this is a threat and a challenge at the same time. And at the same time, there is another statement that we should all think about, and I will try to give the floor to Valeria. What I mean is the statement by Vakhtang KEBULADZE, when he said that many of the things that we used to have in the 20th century, those things were not overcome. What I mean is the imperial trend, the totalitarian regimes. You remember the Endlosung, the final decision of the Jewish question in Europe. So from here we realize that the colonial studies discourse is also very important. When we speak about the early 20th century, the catastrophe which in the 20th century was quite obvious, when we had to overcome the experience of the totalitarian regimes, we were able to overcome it in case of the Nazi regime, which was a totalitarian regime that was a threat to humanity, but we were not. So we had the Nuremberg trial, and we had a processing of the past, but there was no trial for the communist leaders, for the communist ideology. And what Vakhtang KEBULADZE was speaking about, that's the situation of modern day Russia. When we speak about catastrophe on the local level, it's very important. We need to take it into account. It's very important how we can define the processes of the 20th century and how we can extrapolate those definitions to the 21st century. So you remember that phrase about having Beethoven, Schiller, and Goethe, who were Germans, but at the same time in Weimar, where they worked, near to that city, there was a concentration camp. The Buchenwald concentration camp was set up near to that city. So the question is, how should we perceive this paradigm of contemporary Russian culture within the terminology of sociocultural challenges, and to what degree can we speak about the culture of Shostakovich and Pushkin through the prism of these serious threats? So I would like to focus our discussion from a global level to a more local level. So we are speaking about a catastrophe which gives a chance for catharsis, but I think that we should narrow down a little bit in our discussion and speak about threats that people in Eastern Europe are experiencing in connection to the actions demonstrated by our neighbor in the north and in the east. And let's think about ways in which we can fight these catastrophes. And the final thing I'd like to say before I give the mic to Valeria is the following. Do you remember that statement about the catastrophe expressed in the early 21st century by Vladimir Putin, who said that in his opinion the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century is the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the concept of catastrophe can be perceived in this context as well. So Valeria, I am having a question for you. How relevant is this type of discourse for you and this transition to the analysis of the processes that have become relevant over the past several years or maybe a decade? How relevant is it in the context of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and how can we find ways to get out of this catastrophe? Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. Thank you for this interesting experience. I'm coming back to the public stage. It's an interesting experience for me to be able to deliver this speech publicly. I'd also like to thank the attendees for coming here and spending their time here with us. The topic we are discussing may seem quite abstract, but it's very important, actually, very significant. What I'd like to add to the notion of catastrophe is the concept of disruption. Disruption is an event which disrupts a normal course of life. And in this respect, signification happens when we give significance to a significant event. So on the one hand, I'd like to speak about the frequency of these disruptive events which affect our perception of life and lifestyle. And on the other hand, I'd like to speak about us giving significance to these disruptive events. So I will not be speaking about catastrophe as a culture topos, but I will speak about catastrophe as a cultural trope, our usual way of giving significance to cultural events. I would focus not so much on specific events, but on catastrophism as some type of perception. We are following negative events. We have this specific alertness or sensitivity to negative events. And this creates a sense of threat and anticipation of the worst. So where does it come from? And here, because we as researchers always discuss the concepts and the terms that we are using, I have my definition of culture. I see culture as a network, as a set of cultural codes. And what we call modern culture, which can be universal but at its core is Western European, is currently at the stage where catastrophism is the prevailing mood. Where does it come from? And here we have a constellation of several factors. And if you don't mind, I would like to start from this universal context, because we have modern culture which wants to be universal, and there are cultures, there are local variations of cultures. And Thus, I'd like to start from the universal context and focus a little bit more on the Ukrainian context and speak about our catastrophism, whether we have it or not, and whether it makes sense to speak about the catastrophe in general. So I will just briefly outline how I see the catastrophism of modern culture and what are the factors affecting it, because there are different glossaries describing the same notions basically. What it boils down to is the first one, the negative consequences of modernization. This is the shadow of modernity. Negative consequences of good intentions, when this faith in the future, in the best future, turn out and result actually in concentration camps, already mentioned by previous speakers. At the same time, what I believe to be significant, we need to distinguish between the shadow of modernity and the price of modernity. What I mean by this, the shadow of modernity is something that was not foreseen, was not anticipated, but it happened just. The move towards something positive also has negative consequences. When I speak about the price of modernity, I mean specific local contexts which can be called follow-up modernization. And if we come back to one of the speeches of Stalin, back in the day when he said, we are surrounded by enemies, we are lagging behind from the West in economics, and we need to force our modernization, and we will do everything to achieve that. So what it means, we are aware of the price it will take to reach our end goal. So in any case, whether this is conscious or subconscious, we take it as a fact. There is a negative side to the generally positive move forward. That's the first factor. The second factor, paradoxically, that's the success of modernity. I don't know how relevant it is for our context, probably not, but this is more relevant for the Western European crisis, that people feel threatened because all the best things have already happened, because they lose faith in this good future. I will be reiterating this expression. When you can no longer imagine the best future, that's the end of the utopia, because we have already achieved a lot. We have technological achievements, so we are already living during the final stage of this utopia. It turned out that there is a significant psychodrama in this, because when you have already achieved what you wanted to do, what is left for you is to linger to it and to be afraid to lose it. So this again involves globalization, when threat comes not just from the future, but it comes from territorially distant countries, migrants that want to take away our privileges and are a threat to our way of life. And in the anthropological sense, it's very interesting to see how this figure of rebel turns into the figure of layman that needs some extreme negative news. It's a kind of addiction. When you are addicted to clickbait news, to feel alive, to feel that something is happening, and you need a very strong stress to feel that something is happening around you. And the other thing I'd like to mention in this respect is the economy of attention and how media works. Our organism and survival mechanisms work in such a way that negative news create a more strong response. Thus, media have better traffic when they show bad news, but specific bad news. So this is a subconscious request for photogenic catastrophes. Catastrophes with explosions are more photogenic than gradual genocide somewhere in Africa. So this internal logics, which has the economic and value component, and which also has the request of a layman that wants to be thrilled by some negative news, they coincide, and this results in having more and more catastrophes. We have a selective sample of information that are being broadcasted to the general public. Thank you, Valeria. Just a couple of comments about what you've just mentioned. At the very beginning, you mentioned the text Dialectics of Renaissance, and one of the texts is called Culture Industry. In the early 20th century, we've had this quite novel process when culture started transforming into something that is massive, that is involving some profit, and Adorno writes about this with anxiety, and it is important. These works are important. This famous statement, whether we can have poetry after Auschwitz. But here we need to remember this figure of a layman, this layman person, that responds strongly to sensations, to catastrophic events, and of course this increases ratings, and we can say that this is a general civilizational phenomenon, because linguists can tell us that synonyms and idioms regarding negative things are more abundant than things describing positive phenomena and concepts. When we speak about this negativism, we need to pay attention to the second participant of our discussion, Professor Leszek Ochanovich, who is actually researching the concept of catastrophism, and who discusses various types of fears typical for laymen. And as far as I understand, there are many interesting works that he has authored. So in this context of negativism and modernity and progress, and how vulnerable they are under current circumstances, I think that Professor can join in on our discussion and express his opinion.
Перш за все, я хотів би висловити вдячність.
I would like to express my gratitude for invitation me here to this beautiful city, and also for this interesting congress. I am always happy to be here with my colleagues. And speaking about catastrophe, I would like just to say several remarks, maybe not much more interconnected, but it is what is interesting for me in this circumstances. First, of course, catastrophe is, how to say, inscribed into Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and so on. One of our writers, Stempowski, said that in Poland the easiest way to be Cassandra, because it is always successful. If you are Cassandra, you are always successful in the prediction of the future. It was Stempowski who's also interested in the Ukrainian culture. Maybe it is too pessimistic, but first I would like to start with some following Valeria was with some conceptual distinction. I agree with catastrophe is a disruption, but it is even more than disruption, because in my understanding of catastrophe is also kind of starting something new. It is like beginning of the new trajectory of life. Here I would like to draw on Alain Badiou, French philosopher, and his concept of event. Event is something which disrupts the normal situation, but this disruption is already predicted because there is a gap in normal situation. Let's say his examples are Roman Empire is falling down, needing new ideas, and then Jesus Christ came and starting a new situation, new ideological civilization, and so on and so on. And even what is more for Badiou, then this event we can also call catastrophe, is starting new subjects and who became militants. This is the very important for him. So it is like the disruption, but disruption which starting something new, not only in the sense of new situation, but also starting new in the sense of new subjects, new relation, even a new psychology. It can be on the everyday level. His example is first meeting of lovers. Of course, first meeting of lovers changed their life, changed their situation. They were waiting for this. There was a gap in their lives. So from this point of view, we can also look at the pandemics. And the pandemics in the sense what pandemics reveals, or what pandemics revealed already. What pandemics allows us to understand. And the second conceptual point is catastrophe and everyday life, which is also to some extent topic of our panel. Everyday life, as we know now, is an invention of modernity. I am not saying that before there was no everyday life. Yes, it was, but living in everyday life is a kind of new phenomenon connected with modernity. And there is the interesting paradox involved in everyday life in modernity. Paradox which consists in double character of everyday life. On one hand, everyday life is predictable, is safe, is secure. But on the other hand, it is also very boring. We dream of something exciting. We dream of something new, about new situations and so on and so on. And we try to find this through art, horrors, thrillers, but also through extreme sports and so on and so on. But the paradox consists also in this, that if everyday life, this textile of everyday life is destroyed, then we immediately starting to dream about returning to the normality, to the normal situation. And there is an interesting sociological book written by French sociologist Lig Boltanski on criminal novels. Criminal novels are like Sherlock Holmes, are built on this paradox. Sherlock Holmes is bored with his everyday life. He's melancholic, taking a lot of morphine, playing violin and so on and so on. And suddenly somebody came and speaking about strange creature, which is like the old curse of the aristocratic family in Scotland. And he became exciting, going to Scotland, and of course everybody knows the plot of Baskerville. It turned out that it was just a dog with special eyes and so on and so on. And then, so his effort is to change something miraculous in normal. But if miraculous became normal, then of course boredom and so on and so on, and the feeling of being bored. So this pendulum makes people anxiety in modernity. They are always trying, and it was said here, that we are looking for bad news, but bad news are exciting. So we are looking for excitement, but on the other hand, we are afraid of this bad news about this excitement. It is maybe a little bit like, you know, there is a famous Kant category, sublime, that you are looking through the window on the sea, and you have a view of a boat fighting for surviving, but you are safe. So it is a kind of this sublime became like a normal situation in sociological situation in modernity. And the other question is that modernity is also very, very complicated. I mean, our lives in modernity, our lives in democratic society are very complex, and also sometimes from psychological point of view, our perception is not suitable for surviving. For instance, there was a very interesting paper which was discussed among political psychologists, that one of the American political psychologists said that populism, which we confront, is the effect of the success of liberal democracy. Because liberal democracy tried to include all procedure, all people, and so on, and it became so complicated that nobody, or almost nobody, is able to follow this. So people now looking for simple solution. And the third remark is about pandemic. And for me, the pandemic is an interesting phenomenon, because I wonder if pandemics really change anything. Of course, we used to live, and we are still living a very strange life and so on, with this mask and vaccination and so on. But on the other hand, if we look closely into a pandemic, I would say that it is more like the accelerator or, you know, game changer. But it is not creating anything new. For instance, people are saying that in pandemic we are lonely, which is true. But on the other hand, it is quite clear that we had been lonely even before pandemic. It was quite the same phenomena. Pandemic just makes us aware of this loneliness. For instance, we suddenly discover that they are lonely old people. We should help them because they don't survive in these circumstances. But they were already there. They lived. They were as lonely as we saw this because of pandemic. The other things is that pandemics made us aware that we should share resources with other people. So there is now a lot of papers and even books about new social justice. But we knew this before. So it was pandemics which, I wouldn't say only, but I would say that pandemics made us aware of this inequality in the world, which exists before the pandemics. Also, pandemics made us aware about necessity of cooperation between people, but also between countries. But again, it was quite clear that we need this cooperation. And the last thing, maybe I would say that the problem with pandemics is also that some big problems like climate and so on, to some extent disappeared. You know, we were so obsessed with pandemics, but you know, the problem with climate, the problem with polluted air is still there. So it doesn't disappear. So maybe concluding, I would say that if we look at the problem of catastrophe, for sure, it is one of the crucial problem for understanding modernity, which was said already. But I would also encourage people to look at the things which emerge from catastrophe. So to look at the catastrophe, I wouldn't say positive, because catastrophe is always negative. It is like the inscribed in definition of catastrophe. But to look at, let's say, hope, which we can have even if we live in catastrophic times.
Так, по свіжих слідах Валерія Корабльова може відрефлектувати на сказане.
Everything Valeria Korobleva can reflect. I really wanted to get back to that point. Why I said that it is important to differentiate between event and our evaluation. Disruption or catastrophe, this is a threat to our normal life, but it does not mean that something that goes after this is going to be negative. We control this process, semiotic process, by which definition, by which value we give to those processes. And here I would like to differentiate between two lines of thoughts about that, which Mr. Leszek identified in his speech. One is left modern discourse, which is very inverted way of thinking of that Western Ukrainian layman I was talking about before. From the point of left approach, the world of liberal democracy is so destroyed, so damaged, that it cannot be changed slowly and gradually. We need really significant catastrophe to destroy old world and build a new and a perfect one. And in this sense, Badiou, Zizek, in what he talks about avenir and futur, it's some kind of feeling that everything that we have currently will disappear and we will get something absolutely new. This type of thinking seems dangerous for me, so I encourage to have more nuance perception, and I would rather refer to Ulrich Beck and his idea of participation, that is an inverted version of early modern. From that understanding that we anticipate something perfect, but if something bad happens on the way, we understand that yes, there are lots of bad things going on, but we are still trying to find positive side in them. That's what Mr. Leszek mentioned in the end of his speech. And in this sense, we see something positive already in this event, similarly to pandemic, as we have heard from Pascal GIELEN and Vakhtang. Masks do create distance, but at the same time they simplify distance, because digital media we build different type of intimacy and so on and so forth. So it is a disruption of regular normal way of life, and it gives us the possibility to stop, because culture is also about slow thinking. It's about re-evaluation of priorities and our patterns of behavior. And in this sense, this emancipatory catastrophism of Beck is a great recipe on how to react on catastrophes. I think that the mentioning of Ulrich Beck is very relevant here, because one of his one of his key concepts, the society of risk, shows us that we need to learn in such conditions when catastrophe is a factor we need to live with. By the way, in Greek, in ancient Greek, we have the words similar to catastrophe, cataclysm, and we need to understand how to use those words. But I would also like to mention, to reflect to some Mr. Leszek's conditions, that he mentioned that we have some obsession of new, and it is culture of modernity. We cannot say this about culture, about antiquity. It's a process of modernity that was indicated by Dutch researcher Johan Huizinga, who mentioned about the shadow of tomorrow, when he mentioned that we live in the epoch when everything new is absolutely valuable, even though it may not be very productive for us. And this obsession by new, by something new, we're not interested in news, we're interested in bad news. And in this point, of course, we face a huge challenge, and it's another moment that we mentioned here. It's this will to react to different solutions in a very simple way, and that's what we are dealing with in the last several years. It is this wave of populism which covered the whole world. We understand elections of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson in some case, and our Ukrainian situation. And basically, I would like to draw attention to the process in Eastern Europe. That's what Valeria belongs to. Researchers who are working in Czech Republic University. The same can be said about Miloš Zeman and his choice. Not Dragos was chosen, who is an intellectual, but a person who suggested simple issues, simple questions on difficult simple answers to difficult questions. If to paraphrase a very critically perceived introduction to the manifesto of the Communist Party of Marx and Engels, there is a ghost which is wandering around Europe, the ghost of the communism, and it's still wandering around the world. But now it's the ghost of populism. And in this sense, we also talk about such things in this context. So maybe Mr. Leszek will have some thoughts, and then maybe Victoria can talk about something.
I don't know. A lot of things were said here, and I agree entirely with what you both said. But maybe one more things. One more small thing. I am thinking about education. Education as a remedium. We are here, all educators, students are potential educations in the future. And I am thinking that education should prepare people not only for, how to say, normal life, but also for this disruption. Once I wrote a paper about education for the state of crisis, and I think that we should look at the education as a kind of the preparation, for new, which can be also danger. We can prepare people for failure. I remember it was a little bit funny in academic life that one researcher from United States sent, and then it became very popular, CV of failures. The grants I didn't got, the papers which were rejected, and so on and so on. At the end, he said that the biggest failure is that this my CV is the most popular my work ever. And it is, of course, a joke, but I think that we should think about preparing our students, also pupils in schools and so on. First for failure, second for possibility of catastrophe and finding a creative way of coping with this, and third also for conflict, because one of the illusion is that we can live in the society without conflict. And maybe even this pandemics is one of these events which a little bit cover this reality, because in pandemic we, especially at the beginning, we felt that we are on the equal level and so on and so on. But it turned out that also the pandemics can influence some discussion, conflictual discussion. So I would stress the role of education. If we live, as you said, and I agree, in a risk society, referring to back, we should prepare people to living in a risk society, not make them cherish illusion of, smoothly development and so on and so on.
Так, пані Вікторія, будь ласка.
Валерія.
Yeah, sorry. So I think that our coaching industry is very powerful nowadays. It is actually based on this, that each failure is not a catastrophe, it's a possibility, it's a valuable experience. And even though some statements are pretty surface, but there is a rational grain, is that we sometimes differentiate and signify and give it sense. Concerning populism and search of having simple answers to difficult questions, the very label populism is one of the variants of simple answer to a difficult question, because very often we are put a very difficult political phenomenon in one box of populism. If we look at all countries, listed countries, if you take Ukraine, Czech Republic, and so on, it will be very different populisms. But what is important here, if we evaluate this trend in the context of our today's discussion, it is obvious that today's media created this virtual public space that does not have any boundaries that destroyed this political phenomenon of gatekeeping when everybody enters this political space and he or she needs to prove that his or her expertise, and it changes the balance of powers and political plane. But the second other important aspect is politicization of emotions. It has always been present in the politics, but now it's even more and more present. And the other thing that I would like to mention in our discussion, it seems important to me, it's the idea of Dominic Monissi in his book Geopolitics of Emotions. How fear and hope can change modern world. The very idea of geopolitics of emotions gives pretty interesting view, and it seems that it's very important for Ukraine because very often we of course state our own uniqueness, but we try to compare ourselves with neighboring countries and see some genetic similarity, but very often we have our own specifics, and it seems to me that this political role of hope plays very important role in our collective psyche. Thank you for collective hope. It's hope as of such an drive of political sphere. We very often talk about this hope, but in what was said before, our discussion, this moment of combining on the same side similar words, catastrophe and catharsis. It is obvious that catastrophe is not only some ruining process, but something that gives us the possibility to rethink something, and it brings us to catharsis, to purification. But whether it always happens, it's also an open question. How do we think about catastrophe? How it is used? Whether it is used in a good way? I remember Mr. Leszek once cited Rilke, a famous Austrian poet, about how a person can use some negative experience as a certain chance. And in this aspect, I would like to get back still to the statement of Mr. Leszek about education and slowness. Let's remember in German, education is Bildung. It's not just education. It's something that is connected with very slow formation of mountains, because it takes time for them to form, and any kind of education needs this slowness, this deepening. We cannot say this about our reality when this clip reception of everything is actualized in this perception of something, of everything new as something negative. And in this sense we can reflect about many other things. Maybe we shouldn't demonize speed or the acceleration, because we move pace, because we move faster, we go faster, we think faster, we react faster. But at the same time we need to also mention another German intellectual, poet, philosopher, Goethe, who coined very interesting term velociferisch, when he combined Latin word velocitas and luciferisch. So velocitas speed, luciferisch devilish, and any kind of speed when a person thinks as fast as possible, when people think as fast as possible, they lose some clear, realistic and deep understanding of what is going on around them. And this moment of staying in a community of risk, society of risk, it is this acceleration, maximum acceleration, that is perceived as something as granted, for granted. And sociologist Erikson, German sociologist, mentioned about tyranny of the moment. It's very old work from 2000s, but it's still very topical, it's still up to date, and it seems to me that we need to reflect about this as well and talk about that. Mr. Leszek, please. Maybe you have some thoughts about that. That society, we do not have just society of risk, but society where speed dominates, and how this position of education, how it is under threat because of this speed, this ability to reflect, to critically perceive everything that is happening around us. And those fears that you have mentioned in your jobs and your works, different types of fears. I'm not going to go deeper here, but still.
Maybe shortly, this is an interesting, very interesting subject, this speed. This speed which, when I start lectures with my student on modernity, I am starting with my own example, how I wrote my PhD, writing with handwriting and then giving to typewriter and so on and so on. And then usually they don't believe. For them cell phones, computers and so on. And even my grandmother, who used to live in the Austrian Empire in Galicia, told me about the first train, how people were afraid. It is only 3 generations, and of course, this speed, this acceleration, which is probably one of the most important sign of modernity. There is now a very popular German sociologist, I think that Hermann Rosa, who developed the concept of acceleration and modernity. But again, I am trying to come back to education, because I am thinking that, there is a saying that generals always wage past wars, that they are not prepared for the new war. And I am now thinking, what you said, it made me think, if it is not the same with our education, that we educate people for the past, and how to for the past, for the how to say, old cultural and ideological situation. And there is an interesting contradiction, because I also agree that usually culture is slow, is to some extent slow. But civilization is not slow, civilization accelerates. And this deep gap make us anxious about the future. And what is the solution? Of course, it is not possible to give ultimate answer in panel. But for instance, there are some people, like in Poland, there is a sociologist who is also politician, and he said that we stop. I mean, his idea is that we should stop technological progress, because we are not prepared for this. Maybe, but how to do this? How to do this? How we stop the progress, technological progress? I think that it is impossible. Stanisław Lem, we now in the anniversary of his 100 years of birthday, said that technological progress is like evolution. When it starts, it also change everything. So maybe again come back to education, thinking about how to educate people for being creative and open to the future.
Thank you for your reflections, Professor. I'd like to transition to a more local dimension in the perception of catastrophes and the changes that cause acceleration and that we may not reflect on properly. So just the previous statement by Valeria was about the fact that we need to distinguish between the notions, and any intellectual or researcher should not be generalizing. They should constantly look for specific paradigms within a more unified model. And you mentioned the problematics of Eastern Europe. So we speak about Czech Republic, Poland, and Ukraine, and we constantly need to factor in some specificities of these countries. So can we probably, at least very briefly, using your own experience of teaching for Ukrainian students and also Czech students. So from your own experience, how could you characterize the mental differences that Eastern European countries have, and how do these differences characterize students and young researchers when they tackle the issues of modernity and all the other problems that we have discussed, the technological factor, the civilizational factor, the speed of change or populism? So are there any convergences or divergences? So from your own experience of teaching at Karlovy University or the Taras Shevchenko University in Kyiv, or any other universities where you taught, so you had some internship at Princeton. So yes, I do have an experience. So that was Stanford, not Princeton, where I had my internship. So I can compare Swiss American students with Eastern European students. So I'd like to start with a remark regarding what Leszek just said. It's obvious that in education we are switching from conveying knowledge to creating skills. So we need to change our mindset in such a way to be open to change. And this acceleration for me creates new interesting effects. If we look at the early modernity, where we said that with the help of technological process we create an artificial world, which is where we exist, and the natural environment is secondary and less important. So people not living in cities as at the centers of civilization, they are on the outskirts. Right now we are switching this hierarchy. On the one hand, it's very important to adjust to the dynamics to go with the times. I'm quite skeptical about conservative ideas of stopping progress. I think we need to accept the progress, and we need to acquire new skills, and we need to be literate about modern technologies. But at the same time, we need to be able to create spaces outside the technological environment, in nature, in our intimate communication. So we need to have these islands of digital detox. And today, these islands become more significant. The switch of our hierarchy of values and our perception of this stress between nature and culture tells us that we need to move from the idea of a person of progress to the perception of a person living in nature, in the natural environment. So we need to factor in this natural component of a human being, and I think this is worth noting as well. As far as the differences between students are concerned, it's quite a complicated topic, where I wouldn't want to switch on my inner sensor, but if to speak very briefly, students in the West, they have this basic thing about them. They are curious, they want to know more, they have the curiosity. When we teach in our environment, because of the unresolved trauma, our students in Central and Eastern Europe, there is this competitive martyrdom, excuse me for using English words. So we have competitive martyrdom, just trying to appear to be a big martyr, to try and prove that we have suffered from something and use this as a moral alibi. And this is a hindrance on the way to healthy curiosity. Thank you. I would also like to reflect on the idea of finding for islands of detox, islands free from digital technology. As Naispeak would say, he speaks about the areas poisoned by technology, and you are speaking about islands of detox. So if we use Naspet's terminology, but what I mean is slightly different. So how do we, while keeping up with the technological process, not lose some cultural senses? I think that what you've just mentioned, Valeria, about the periphery, about people being on the outskirts, I think that the situation is changing. So I would like to appeal to the following. So we have students in the West and we have students in Eastern Europe, but we also have students in the East, we have students in Japan, and the Japanese culture foresees modernization without westernization, and they cultivate this merger of human nature and technology. So in addition to their technological advancement, I think the Japanese have managed to find the balance between civilization and nature, and I think this is a very valuable experience that we need to take into account, in particular in context of the climate challenges. We are all aware of the Kyoto Protocol, which was signed a long time ago, but the thing is, what is quite notable, that it was signed in Kyoto, the old capital of Japan. I think that we should consider these things. We often also speak about the corona crisis, we speak about the COVID, and we say that this is the most immediate issue that we need to tackle. In Europe, in Western Europe, in Germany in particular, people more and more often say that there is a generation gap, that the youngsters and the elderly people, if we compare them, the elderly are more anxious about the pandemic, while the youngsters are more concerned about the world they will be living in 20, 30 or 40 years from now, and they are more interested and more actually concerned about the climate change, because there are very many studies which appear quite threatening. And we should remember the bestseller of the early 21st century, the book of the British astrophysicist Martin Rees, and the book is titled Our Last Century. And the author had this title with a question mark, and then the publishers took the question marks away. And when this book was published in the United States, everything happens faster. In the United States, they renamed the book into Our Last Hour. So what I'm driving at, Martin Rees is the astronomer, is His Majesty's astronomer. There is this position in conservative Great Britain, and he is a notable researcher, and there are very many researchers like that that urge us to have a serious look at the challenges. We are all speaking about the pandemic, while the problem of climate change, which is also very essential and vital, it's put on the margins. So Valeria, would you like to comment on this, or Leszek maybe? I think that again this is a kind of a trend, because if we look at the books that are currently published in the sphere of political science and political theory, so the titles would be How Democracy Ends, How Democracy Dies. So constantly, if we had this period of the death of the author, the death of the ideology, now we are in the middle of an era where we are expressing our ideas about the end of the usual world associated with liberal democracy. My question is whether this alarmism is beneficial, because it's obvious that the objective is to be a wake-up call, to draw attention so that we are able to prevent such things. And coming back to Ulrich Beck and his final book, Our Age of Metamorphosis, so he wrote that if we used to have self-fulfilling prophecies, we are now having self-fulfilling prophecies. Prophecies made so that they don't happen, self-failing. We are speaking about that, but we don't actually mean it. So this is a kind of magical thinking. If we say democracy is dead 3 times, then it won't actually happen. I think there are limits to the efficiency of this tool, and we are approaching the limits, and we need to think of other ways of thinking and behaving with these issues. I totally agree with you. Realization of danger is always the first step in overcoming it. Sorry for appealing to German authors again. So Friedrich Goederlin, in one of his poems, wrote that where we have danger, the survival is born. So we constantly need to realize the significance of being aware of dangers. And this alarmism, which you mentioned, is quite useful, and I agree with what you've just said. Leszek, you're welcome.
Actually, too big subject, but in reference what Valeria said, I am thinking about the problem of the body, because one of the things pandemic made us aware is that we have body, that we are embodied creature. And the body is fragile. It is not only fragility of culture, but also fragility of our body. And for some reason, and it is, we can discuss this long, the problem of the body disappeared in the Western thought. But even if it reappeared, let's say with Foucault, body was also again looked upon as a locus of oppression. But we should, and this is maybe also education. I am working with American philosopher Richard Schusterman, who is trying to develop the so-called soma aesthetics, the concept of the aesthetics of the body, a body as a vehicle of emancipation. A body because, you know, almost everything in our life is dependent on our consciousness of the body, how we use body, how we developed our senses, how we developed our awareness of body, influence heavily all our social and personal relation. This is one thing I would like to add, and it is in connection what Valeria said about this returning to nature, to being outside cities and so on and so on. It is extremely important, but not forget our bodies. And the second, this is interesting about this detox and the island, because just recently I developed with my former PhD student, who is now professor of pedagogy, the concept of pedagogy of asylum. Asylum as a something to exclude people, exclude students from, let's say, normal normal problems. To some extent, or I would even I would say that normal life, to make like a community which could start a new style of thinking. I am not so much, how to say, obsessed with this new media. We use this, and my son used this, and so on and so on. But it is necessary to have some distance which can give us only no humanistic education. So we come back to the humanistic education, but probably we need something like a new humanistic education. Because, you know, I am always thinking that we have new ways of communication, better and better, but we less and less to communicate. So we should escape this paradox.
Ну, я думаю, що, власне, поняття humanistic education, воно так чи інакше.
And in this or that way is quite comprehensive. If we look at the etymology of humanitas, which is very close to paideia, the Greek word for upbringing. So education at its core is humanistic, and we should constantly remember about it, because even if we draw the distinction between humanities and natural sciences, pedagogy and education is a humanistic sphere. This is quite important as well. So Valeria, you're welcome. We have some 10 minutes left, and I think we need to draw some conclusions to our discussion. The topic of body is very interesting, and how politically and culturally it is interpreted, just what Leszek just mentioned. On the one hand, we have come back to the concept of body within social criticism. Bembe just recently published the book Necropolicy, when the state decides which body continues living and which body is not worth living. So who are we going to save when we have only several ventilators available, if we look at the COVID pandemic? On the other hand, bodies are seen as tools of occupying the public spaces. This is what we call street politics. Ukrainian Maidan and protests in Europe. So it is enough just to take to the streets, and your public presence in the public spaces has a political significance. That's what we saw on the silent protest, the picture of the silent protest demonstrated by Pascal GIELEN. The pandemic showed us another access to this problem. We look at our body as a vulnerable object of threat. How can we reoccupy our body? The inclusion of body into political spaces gives us space for consideration. As far as catastrophism is concerned, that will be probably my closing remark. So yes, this is really a paradox. Even if we look at the number of catastrophic events in the past and present of Ukraine, I think that catastrophism is not something typical for Ukrainian culture. And I'd like to leave you with this statement so that you can think about it. We are exhausted, but we have not given up. We are activists who want to believe that something better is coming in the future. We don't have this golden past, this imaginary past that we can go back to in our dreams. Our history is a history of challenges and turmoil, which we've survived. But we also want to live, not survive. So I think that our background and our history creates this vector for the future, which we want to consider not in catastrophic tones. Thank you for this optimistic point of view. It's quite valuable, and I think it's quite positive for Ukrainians to hear. And so practically, you've outlined what we heard today, because Pascal GIELEN spoke about this physical presence, a concept which was key to his presentation, and we are coming back to this important idea. The other thing is that we probably need to reactivate our extensive experience and knowledge in philosophy and bodily philosophy. We need to come back to Maurice Merleau-Ponty with his phenomenology of perception and other important texts that under new circumstances may have a second reading. And towards the very end, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Leszek Ochanovich, and ask you to reflect a little bit, to come back to important ideas and messages that were voiced today, and what inspired you the most today, and which ideas you'd like to revisit, summarizing our today's discussion. You're welcome.
I would like, psychologists usually say that you hear what you are prepared to hear. And of course, I refer our discussion to my own work in last maybe 5-6 years. I am working on non-consensual dialogue and non-consensual democracy. The main idea of this is that dialogue is important, but dialogue is not for agreement, but for better understanding. And I think that it is also interconnected with our experience, I mean our Eastern European experience, that understanding is important. We can disagree on many things, but what is the most important is to ability to take the role of the other, to take the role of the other, to look at the situation through the eyes of the other. And even if we don't come to the agreement, in fact, I think that agreement is a kind of miraculous, because I am I, you are you, and so on. So it is almost impossible, but understanding, or at least attempt at understanding, is very much possible, even in the time of catastrophe.
Дуже дякую за
Thank you very much for your closing remarks. So, dear colleagues, I believe that our today's discussion, which unfortunately was conducted in a very limited circle of participants, because we were expecting more panelists and another person was supposed to moderate our today's panel. These changes just show us how catastrophism can interfere in organization of conferences dedicated to the discussion of catastrophes, how it can be illustrated and embodied in a very specific case. But I hope that our discussion was quite successful, quite beneficial, and primarily it gave all our members of the audience an understanding of some things, and maybe served as an impetus for some kind of reflections. And I hope that further discussions within our Congress will be productive and interesting as well. Thank you for the attention. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, Leszek. Thank you, Valeria. Thank you, Zoriana. And I think we will continue in the same successful manner. Thank you for being a wonderful moderator. And thank you to our audience. Your presence mattered. Всім дякую.